Welcome to the Untold Tales audio anthology, written and narrated by Dr. Jeffrey A. Robinson. Reset. Captain Varric stood on the bridge of his starship and gazed down at the holographic projection in the center of the room. The planet below them was a rare water world at the limit of what his species considered habitable. From their location in low orbit around the newly discovered world, the Saren Empire exploration vessel studied the surface of the pristine world. "Commander Roncor," he said, addressing his first officer, "have you completed your survey of the planet?" His executive officer stood erect, but his head bobbed up and down nervously, revealing the avian origins of his species. The crest of feathers on Roncor's head rose involuntarily with minor apprehension as he replied, "Yes, sir. The planet R34214 is a Type 6b body orbiting the habitable region of its star. It's an almost ideal candidate for colonization, but would nevertheless require some significant environmental adjustment. While it has plenty of water in liquid form and a significant atmosphere, the surface temperature is too high for our people to live without environmental domes, and the oxygen content is twice as high as our home planet. Also, there is an unusually high abundance of very large land and marine life that would have to be removed." Varric stared down at the bridge crew from his command chair on the tall dais near the center of the room. His high perch allowed him to clearly see the holographic display and to observe the activities of his nest of subordinates below him. "What kind of life?" asked Varric. "Well, most of the life forms are reptilian in form, and they're all relatively unevolved species. The largest of the land-based beasts are huge brutes that are 8 to 10 times an individual's height and mass more than 1,000 times as much. However, there are even larger creatures in the oceans. The beasts are massive. I've never before observed land animals this large." Captain Varric considered the commander's findings. "Are there no higher species?" asked Varric, his voice rising to a shrill, interrogating tone. "None that we found, sir. However, there is some evidence of small mammalian species at the bottom of the food chain, but they're just fast-breeding vermin and scavengers that only serve as food for the reptiles." "Go on," said the captain. "There is no sign of avian life forms anywhere, in the giant trees of their jungles or in the nearby mountains. There is no indication of any organized civilization or intelligence anywhere." "Do you have a recommendation?" asked Varric. "Well," said the first officer, "we've obviously need to eradicate the beasts from the planetary surface to make way for any civilized species. The large ground-based creatures would have to be removed to make room for our vertical cities and surrounding agriculture. Some form of ecological modification would be required." This was Roncor's first planetary reforming mission, so Varric planned to test his familiarity with pre-colonization protocols. "Tell me then, Commander, what type of modification scenarios do you feel would be most appropriate in this case?" This was a bit of a trick question since there were more than a dozen options for him to select from. When the commander did not immediately reply, the captain rephrased his question. "All right, then, which ones are not appropriate?" Roncor clicked his beak hesitantly and then said, Well, we don't need to heat up the planet, so modification of the star's heliosphere won't be necessary. Also, with the abundance of liquid water, we wouldn't need to perform comet seeding to deliver ice to the surface. Also, the abundance of life means we don't need to seed the planet with new animal or plant life forms. However, we still would need to lower the temperature, reduce oxygen levels, and eradicate the existing animal populations. So, what are the remaining viable options? Asked the captain. Rancor hesitated and finally said, well, Protocol 8 might apply. We could seed the upper atmosphere with nanoparticles that would reflect more light, thus lowering the amount of light that reaches the planet's surface. If we're lucky, we could lower the overall temperature, kill off much of the plant life, and drive the larger animals into extinction. What are the downsides of that? Asked the captain. It would take longer, since the atmosphere would need to be reseeded several times over the next million years to achieve desired results. Then your recommendation would be what, Commander? Well, he chirped, I think Protocol 11 would be best. We could bombard the planet with large asteroids and basically kill off most life by triggering a mass extinction event. The planet would then be plunged into a winter that would last centuries. All animal life larger than my boot would die, and the planet's ecology would essentially be reset. The long winter could even create ice caps on the planet and permanently change its albedo to make it cooler. We might even trigger a series of ice ages that would keep the planet cool. But wouldn't that take longer? Asked the captain. Yes, it would also take millions of years for the ecology to recover, but it would only take a single intervention rather than scheduling several. Excellent, said the captain. Did you initiate a temporal scan of the planet's ecosystem? Yes, sir. Using what parameters? I launched a survey probe with a singularity engine that was programmed to jump back in time at 1 million year intervals and survey the planet at each point. How far back did you send the probe? Sir, I instructed it to continue jumping until it reached 700 million years in the past, and then instructed it to return to our current time with its data. Let me see the results, said the captain, extending his claw-like hand. The commander handed the captain a data pad that contained all of the survey's findings. However, as his superior officer began studying the ecological history of the candidate colony, he said, wouldn't it be great, sir, if instead of just sending probes back in time, we could go back in time as well? That way we could directly oversee these planet reforming activities. The captain glanced up at his first officer but didn't reply. This was something taught in the first year of military academy. While the singularity drives that powered their ship enabled them to instantly teleport to any point in space-time within its range, only non-organic objects could be translated back in time. When living organisms traveled through time, they died. Unfortunately, all biological processes were disrupted by time travel. Some processes stopped working, some functioned at different rates, others operated in reverse. In any case, time travel was immediately fatal to all living life forms. Even bacteria died if translated back in time more than a few seconds. Varric started to explain this to Rancor, but realized that this was neither the time nor place for such a lecture. He didn't have time to educate this hatchling. However, he was privately grateful that people couldn't travel back in time. From what he understood about temporal mechanics, time travel of that type would greatly enhance the probability of temporal paradoxes and causal loops. Time travel was complicated enough without that type of problem. Therefore, after a moment's pause, the captain turned his attention back to the data pad that he held. "Summarize for me, Commander," he said. "Well," trilled the commander, "life on this planet began in bacterial form about 1 billion years ago, but plants and fungi did not appear on land until about 500 million years ago. Insects and arthropods followed, and amphibians and reptiles appeared about 300 million years ago. And the reptiles have remained the dominant species ever since then?" "Yes, sir." 300 million years is a very long time. Are there no mammalian, marsupial, or avian species?" "A few," replied the commander, "but they're all very small. No avian species here has ever found a viable niche that might have allowed them to develop intelligence. Avians here are little more than flying lizards." "That's odd," noted the captain. "The evolutionary processes here seem to be unusually slow." "So, Commander, when do you think we should schedule a planetary bombardment?" I was thinking about 30 million years ago. That would allow enough time for life to reestablish itself in the new environmental conditions created by the bombardment." Handing the data pad back, Varric said, "Let's assume the expected morphological change rate to be about less than 1/3 of our own. Schedule the bombardment for about 60 million years. With evolution progressing more slowly here, we need to allow extra time for the ecology to recover. If that ends up being too long, we can always do another reset." Gesturing toward the holographic image of the planet that hovered in the center of the room, he said, "Send back 4 probes to about 60 million years ago, and program them to search for and find asteroids in nearby space that are at least 7 Tarl across. Ensure that they impact the planet near the equator for maximum effect. When reformation has been completed, the jungles below should be replaced by an empty pastoral world ready for us to colonize." Roncor nodded and chirped affirmatively as he began to turn away, but Varric stopped him. "Tell me, Commander, why do we use this method of temporal planetary reformation?" "Well, sir, because it's faster, of course. We can terraform the planet starting long ago and thus ensure that it will be ready for us when the changes we make in the past catch up to current time." "But why do we need to establish colonies so quickly?" The first offer hesitated. "Because of the war?" "Yes," said the captain. "Because a warlike, starfaring race discovered us 8 centuries ago and started destroying our colonies. By unfortunate coincidence, they desire worlds that are almost identical to our own. Whenever they find one of our colonies, they destroy it and take over the planet. In retaliation, we've destroyed some of their colonies using the same types of temporal reformation resets that we're going to use today. But the enemy continues to find our colonies and wipe them out. We've only endured it as a civilization because they don't possess the technology to teleport through time and space, and we can thus establish new colonies faster than they can. They have faster-than-light star drives, but nevertheless, we travel faster. Regrettably, their weaponry is superior to ours. Someday, if we can ever discover their home world, we might be able to end this war. But until then, we need to reestablish our colonies as fast as possible to replace the ones we've lost, and we need to destroy any colonies of the enemy that we find. That's why it's so important to build new colonies so quickly. We have to claim as many worlds as we can before the enemy does." Varric paused. He was wasting time again. These were things Roncor should already know. "Enough," he squawked. "Launch the probes and move our ship into temporal stasis. It took a few minutes to program and launch the terraforming probes. When we're safely in stasis, monitor space-time around us and let me know when the temporal alteration wave has safely passed us. Roncor busied himself with preparation, and after long minutes he announced, "Temporal terraform probes are away, sir." As soon as the probes disappeared from view, the lights on the command deck dimmed and their ship shimmered as they shifted out of normal space into a place that was technically outside of space-time. While their starship could not move forward or back in time without killing the crew, the ship's singularity engines could lock into a specific moment. Technically, they would be outside the time stream in a pocket universe all their own. That way they would be safe when the changes they made in the past propagated forward outside. The holographic display of the planet below them became blurred and obscured. Everyone on the bridge waited uncomfortably, knowing that when they return to normal space, that the world below them will have been dramatically changed. "We are safely in stasis," confirmed Roncor. "We're now waiting for the temporal alteration wave to pass us." No one spoke as they waited. The bridge of the ship was silent except for the faint beeping of active displays at the navigation and weapon stations nearby. However, after a few minutes, a chime sounded and the lights on the bridge brightened once more. "Leaving stasis field now," said Commander Roncor, "initiating a new planetary scan." Captain Varric looked out at the planet that was displayed on the technical display. It did indeed look different. There were polar ice caps where there had been none before, and the continental land masses looked larger, as if the oceans were lower. "Talk to me," commanded Varric. "Tell me what I'm seeing." The first officer replied, "The world has been altered significantly. Overall temperatures are significantly cooler. Oxygen levels have dropped from 35% to 16%. Sea levels are lower and there's far less vegetation. But—" Then Roncor stopped talking. "But what?" retorted Varric. I have to show you." Then the commander changed the image of the planet on the view screen, showing the night side of the planet. "Look." Varric blinked in surprise. Instead of a dark planet, the surface was covered with a web of lights that stretched from one horizon to the next. "What is this?" he asked. "Those lights are cities. Hundreds, no, thousands of cities. The large lizards are gone, but they've been replaced with a new species that possesses a very significant level of technology." Pausing for a moment, the first officer said, "Sir, I thought you said evolution here was much slower and that the world would be pastoral, waiting for colonization." Varric snapped back. "The harsh conditions after the reset must have sped up the rate of evolution. This shouldn't be possible. The life below is very different than it was before. There are literally billions of life forms present, and they seem to have become the dominant species in this world." Then Varric's eyes grew wide in horror. "By all the deities," he screeched, "there's only one explanation." "What?" asked Roncor. "The enemy. We reset the ecosphere, but somehow the enemy found this planet, and they've already colonized it. This is their colony world now. Quick, scan the space above the surface. Look for evidence of space capabilities." Roncor hurriedly initiated a scan of nearby space. "You're right, sir," he replied. "There are many objects in orbit above us. Most appear to be in synchronous motion with the surface below. There are hundreds of small satellites. But down here in lower orbit, there are more than a dozen much larger objects. They look like—" "Like what?" asked the captain. "They look like military sentinels." Looking up from his workstation, the commander glanced at the captain and added, They're all heavily armed. Silence hung over the room like a dark fog. "What are your orders, sir?" he asked. "First, let's get out of here. If what you say is true, and this is the enemy, we're outnumbered badly." "Should I raise the shields?" "No, that would just alert the sentinels. If we're lucky, we'll still be able to teleport away before they notice us. So charge up the jump coils," and at that moment, the ship lurched unexpectedly and the lights on the bridge flickered. What was that? "One of the weapons stations has fired on us. They must have seen us." "Damn," chortled the captain. "Any damage?" "They hit our portside shield array, so we can't raise shields now." "Can we jump yet?" "No, sir. I have to reroute power away from the damaged shield generators, but it'll only take a moment to recharge the jump drive." Low vibrations sounded across the ship, indicating that they'd been hit once more by the hostile Sentinel satellite. "Well, while we're sitting here, someone take out that orbital sentinel," ordered Varric. The sound of heavy plasma cannons firing confirmed their return fire, and in a moment a bright spot flared and faded on the technical display. "That hostile platform is gone," said Roncourt. "But that's odd. The orbital platforms don't appear to have much armor, and there appear to have no shields of any kind. Their weapons can hurt us, but ours are far superior. However, there are quite a few others within firing range." "How many?" asked the captain. "I count 12 others, and they're all bristling with lasers, particle beams, and kinetic weapons." "Well, don't antagonize them. Just get us out of here." The ship shook again, more violently this time. "The other weapons platforms are targeting us," cried Roncourt. Varric shrieked. "Fire at will. Focus on those orbitals that are attacking us. Take those military battle stations out and jump as soon as those engines have charged enough." The ship lurched like it had been hit by a giant fist, throwing Varric against the nearest bulkhead. Catching himself with one wing, he barely managed to stay upright. "Multiple sentinels are now firing," shrieked Roncourt. "We're returning fire, but there are too many of them." "Damage control report," barked the captain. "Hull integrity breached on decks 4 through 8, responded a nearby technician. "Primary engines are damaged." "Prepare to abandon ship," shouted the captain. "Notify—" But no one heard the captain's last command, as the hull near the bridge ruptured and their ship broke apart, throwing everybody out into the cold vacuum of space. Colonel Jameson soared into the NESOC Operations Center. Red lights around him flashed and alarms sounded. "What the hell's happening?" he shouted. Operations Chief Hank Breyer of the Near-Earth Space Operations Center was hunched over one of the main consoles with technicians on either side of him. "Kill those alarms," he yelled, and moments later silence replaced the blaring noise and shrill sirens. "I ask what's going on," demanded Jameson once more. "Actually, sir," said Hank as he slowly stood erect and turned toward the colonel, "it looks like everything's stopped. I think it's over." "What's over?" "Well, it's kind of hard to say. Everything happened so fast. Until a few moments ago, everything was quiet. There'd been no chatter or activity of any kind for weeks. It's been blissfully boring for the last 6 months, ever since Iran tried to launch their own space-based weapons platform. Fortunately, it blew up shortly after takeoff and never made it out of the atmosphere. One thing we don't need is a turf war in low Earth orbit. Anyway, since then, it's just been a tense standoff between the 8 countries that have space-based weapons in orbit. Since then, it's been ominously quiet. Nothing's happened since the UN negotiated a treaty to prohibit any more launches." "So what just happened?" asked Jameson. "Well, we're still not sure. One minute it was as quiet as a church, then a proximity alarm sounded from one of the orbiting platforms. It looked like a new and much larger orbital platform just appeared out of nowhere. What do you mean by that? Was it a stealth vehicle or a decoy? We don't know, said Hank. We didn't have a chance to figure that out. It wasn't like anything we've ever seen before. Anyway, as soon as it appeared, everyone started screaming and accusing others of breaking the treaty. Russia accused us. Japan said Russia or China must have managed to sneak something into orbit. India accused China, and, well, we stayed out of it until we could figure out what was going on. That's when we called you. And I came right away, insisted Jameson. I was just down the hall in the teleconference with the Joint Chiefs. What the hell happened while I was en route? Well, groaned Hank, as we were trying to figure out what was going on, Israel fired on the object with all 6 of its gigawatt X-ray lasers. They really shot up the intruder. At that point, everyone stopped talking. Then the Israel platform fired at the newcomer again. Finally, the strange vessel fired back and blew up the Israelis with a single shot. For a minute, no one was sure what to do. Everyone stopped yelling at each other and the comms went silent. I thought everything was going to quiet down and assumed that someone would claim there'd been an accidental weapons discharge or something. But a few seconds later, the Russian station fired at the intruder. The strange ship shot back, and within seconds everyone was shouting. We didn't shoot until we came under fire, but we got in a good few shots before the new vessel blew apart. Then it stopped firing, of course, and everyone else stopped firing, too. And that's when you arrived. Suddenly an alarm sounded, and Hank turned back to the console. After a second, he laughed and muted the alarm, turning to the colonel. What was that? He asked. Someone came late to the party. Chuckling, the chief explained. You know the platform that the French sent up a couple years ago, the one with a single megawatt laser? Well, they stayed out of the altercation, probably so they wouldn't draw any fire. But I guess they decided it was embarrassing to have missed this first real space battle. So they just took a shot at the expanding debris field that used to be the intruder. Colonel Jameson shook his head and grinned. That is funny, but somehow oddly appropriate for the French. Everyone in the room looked nervous and stood waiting for the colonel to say something. So what now? Asked Hank. Well, I figure we'll probably need to examine, started Jameson. Wait, said Hank, holding up his hand to the colonel. Touching his earbud, he listened and said, The EU platform is making an announcement. The chief listened more and slowly relayed what was being said to the colonel. The EU is apparently speaking for the UN. They've advised everybody to stand down and stay away from the debris field. Listening some more, Hank added, They're saying there will be an investigation to find out who's responsible, and no one is to tamper with the evidence. Meaning the debris field, I guess. That's rich, said the colonel. That means they'll create a special committee and eventually build a special ship with a multinational crew to fly out and find out what's left. It'll probably take 2 years to design a mission and 2 more years to schedule a launch. Then God knows how long it'll take them to announce any kind of conclusion. So what are your orders? Asked Hank. Do like the EU said. Stand down and start working on a full report that I can take back to the Joint Chiefs. This is going to be a mess no matter what we do. Shaking his head and mumbling, he left the op center. Ultimately, as Colonel Jameson had predicted, it was nearly a decade before the UN published a report, but it was never determined which nation was responsible for breaking the space weapons treaty, and to this day it remains an unexplained mystery. On the other hand, no one ever discovered the link between the alien ship and the disappearance of the dinosaurs more than 60 million years ago. That's the problem with time travel. It's often complicated. Thank you for listening. As you know by now, we love our listeners, fans, patrons, and supporters. Please let us know what you think of our podcast and our stories. The best way to do that is to subscribe to our podcast at untold-tales.com. By doing so, you'll be added to our mailing list so you can be notified of upcoming episodes, blogs, and other information. Thanks again for listening, and have a great day.